and welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones. I really am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection. This week, Dr. Darryl G. Hart joins us to talk about Gresham Machen, progressive democracy, and social gospel. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone. World's End Theology Outlet. Our regular legal disclaimer. Our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Dr. Darryl G. Hart, also known as Machen Boy today, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. The satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall into the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Notice, the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you like this webcast or if it annoys you and you want to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And as you do, never fear, this webcast is Y2K compliant. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. And now we introduce our special guest, Dr. Darryl G. Hart. Greetings, Dr. Hart. Yes, greetings. I normally cut the screen out right here, but I decided to do a little background research on you. We weren't too sure about you, you know. And it turns out you wrote this book called Defending the Faith, J. Gresham Machen and the Crisis of Conservative Protestantism in Modern America. That says 2003. So you're way ahead of your time. But notice how much the hardcover costs now. If you got an extra $250,
oh, wow,
yeah, $250 and change almost. You can get a used copy for $100. So, but I'm going to go with the paperback. Anyways, you also
the hardcover actually, to be clear, was published in 1994, so I was really ahead of my time.
You were so far ahead. The word at the Reform Forum conference you were speaking at was that D.G. Hart's whole life was spent preparing for the year 2023. Is there any truth to that rumor?
Well, no, because I've been surprised by the amount of attention to the book. Not because I don't think the book is worth. I'm talking about Machen's book, Christianity and Liberalism,
right?
Not mine. I'm proud. I hope it. Not in a sinful way, of my book, which was a revised version of my dissertation, and I'm pleased with the way that it has remained in print in the paperback with P&R now. But about Machen's book in particular, I was really surprised because going back to the 75th anniversary, which would have been 1998. Or the 50th anniversary of the book, easier to do for me, 1973. There was no real commemoration then. And I mean, I was at Westminster teaching, as a student in the late 70s, early 80s, and then teaching and directing the library in the 90s. And people didn't really care that much about Machen.
Wow.
It was the beginning of Tim Keller's presence in New York City. He still taught adjunct at the seminary, and whatever you make of Keller, and I have much respect and also much criticism or reservation about aspects of his ministry, but I mean, that's where things were at the time. Harvey Kahn was still there then, and that kind of urban ministry was seemed to be part of what the seminary was interested in, and as well as the PCA, at least parts of the PCA. So again, there wasn't much attention to the book
Hmm.
on the 75th anniversary, let alone to Machen. So that's one of the reasons why I was surprised. Long-winded way of saying it.
And now people are opening it up in 2023 and saying this is prophetic, and it's like this speaks to our time now.
Right. No, it is remarkable. Not only the book, but even the way it was received by the Presbyterian Church USA, the Northern Mainline Church. I mean, as working on different assignments that I've had to do this fall or this year for conferences, different articles I've written, you can see the kind of misinformation, disinformation, discourse, as we call it, of our current political moment, even being used then about Machen and the conservatives in the PCUSA. So, I mean, there are just so many aspects of it that continue to be relevant. But I think there is a timeless quality to the book as well, period.
Well, you also wrote for the Acton Institute, Christianity and Liberalism, the Spirituality of the Church in a Politicized World. That came out August 1st on their website. I want people to know about that. And also, just going to my own bookshelf, this is how prophetic D.G. Hart is deconstructing evangelicalism almost 2 decades before anyone else was using the term deconstruction or deconstructing. We have Deconstructing Evangelicalism, Conservative Protestantism in the Age of Billy Graham by D.G. Hart, Dr. Darryl G. Hart. If you want to comment on that, feel free.
Well, I am frustrated by that book that I think Baker yanked it off the shelf. I don't know. They remaindered it pretty quickly.
Really?
I'm not saying that it would have been a bestseller, but I do think, in hindsight, that a number of my arguments and instincts back then proved to be correct. But again, because the book went off the market so within a year or so, I mean, it never got into. I don't know that maybe it did get into paper, but barely. But they didn't promote it. And at the time, it was a real slap in the face. Yeah. So it wasn't well received in the sense of there was a lot of celebration of evangelicalism at the time, especially the evangelical scholarship, so-called evangelical mind. And I was a negative voice in all that. And for that reason, I can understand why people didn't want to.
Yeah, because right in the introduction, you say, "What's wrong with evangelicalism?" You weren't in with the mood at the time, right? Is that it?
Exactly. But I've been thinking about trying to get it reprinted, but with a revised edition somehow and updating it for the current moment. But that might take more work than it's worth. So, and even by the time it comes back out, what will be the next current thing? So,
well, you also wrote, this helped me a lot. When I wanted to know about John Williamson Nevin, you were there to help me. I just want you to know. I don't know if anyone else here wants to know about him, but I did. My first, I've showed you my first time I ever was introduced to Machen was in his New Testament Greek for Beginners book that I got. Like,
were you using that in the bathtub? Looked like
you can tell, right? Yeah.
Right.
You can tell who the bathtub readers are when they show you their books.
Are those who live in hurricane territory?
Oh yeah. We had a little encounter with a guy named Ian recently, and and this is what we're really. I mean, this is the 100th anniversary, 2023, of Christianity and Liberalism by J. Gresham Machen. And he responded, for those who don't know, he responded to a sermon by Harry Emerson Fosdick. I've heard you on several webcasts. I really thought my favorite title was when you were on Presbycast. Was that you on the Year of Living Machenly? with Brad Isbell?
It could have been, but that was, I mean, Brad's very clever. Or Chortle, so that was not my doing.
Chortle's Weekly, that's his handle. He didn't like to be called a fundamentalist, but he was kind of pegged as one. The fundamentalists were named after this series of books called The Fundamentals, which you can still get.
Wow.
And I thought it was interesting. He didn't like to be called a fundamentalist, but when you look at his table of contents in Christianity and Liberalism, it seems to be, it's not exactly organized the same way, but it's topical in a way similar to the way the fundamentalists were topical. The fundamentals books were the virgin birth, the deity of Christ, the inspiration of scriptures. They don't correspond exactly, but it is similar. And the money quote from this book, the one that everybody likes, comes from the introduction, where he says, but the Christian religion which is meant by him is certainly not the religion of the modern liberal church, but a message of divine grace, almost forgotten now. So that's when he it's like Harry Emerson Fosdick threw down the gauntlet in 1922 with "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" And was it fair to say Machen picked up the gauntlet and slapped Fosdick across the face with it, with this statement?
Well, the timing of it is certainly supports that argument or that interpretation. But I do think that the book really started back in 1920 when Machen attended his first General Assembly. And at that assembly came a proposal from a committee to study church union. This was a plan for organic union of all the major Protestant denominations. They were already cooperating through the Federal Council of Churches, which was formed in 1908, but there was a plan to bring them all into one sort of national Protestant church.
Is this where Hitler got the idea?
Sorry?
Is this where Hitler got the idea?
Well, I mean, there's a kind of nationalism that runs through Western Protestantism at that time, but the embodiment of this in North America was the formation in 1925 of the United Church of Canada. So Canadians did pull off what Americans were trying to do, although the Canadians didn't pull it off because there were Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Methodists that still remained outside the United Church. The proposal in the United States failed, but what made it particularly alarming, I think, for Machen, not only was the doctrinal preamble of the plan really, really bad, very generic, almost virtually not even Trinitarian. It wasn't anti-Trinitarian. It just wasn't. It was so generic as to say nothing. And all of the faculty, conservative faculty at Princeton, wrote against it. One of the last articles that Benjamin Warfield wrote was against this plan for organic union. But Machen was a delegate or commissioner at the assembly. The person who presented the plan was the president of Princeton Seminary, J. Ross Stevenson. So there already you see the sort of dynamite that's going to blow up at the seminary later on in the 1920s. Machen happened to be there. He began to cooperate with some other conservatives in the Philadelphia area, which is where the assembly met. And it's from some of those speaking engagements that Machen had in the Philadelphia and Chester areas after that assembly that the book took shape. So the timing of it is a response to Fosdick's infamous sermon in 1922, Machen's book published 1923. But the origins of it, his thoughts about it, come out of opposition to that plan for organic union.
What were they going to call this national church? Did they have a name picked out? I think I heard.
Oh, man, I don't recall what it was. I mean, there were many union churches throughout the United States that locally embodied different Protestant congregations cooperating together. Machen was part of one of those congregations in Maine where he vacationed with his family. Seal Harbor, Maine, there was a Union Church. That was what it was called, the Union Church. It's still there in Seal Harbor. John D. Rockefeller was a member of it and
Baptist
supported it. And he actually invited Machen to preach at that church. And Machen actually did preach there a couple times in the 1920s. Then eventually he declined to preach there. But so they might have called it the Union Church of America. I don't know what they might have called it.
Maybe they could have called it the One True Church of America.
So, anyways, transitioning. Machen, I mean, he sadly was taken from us, from this country, kind of early in his life, relatively early, but he had accomplished so much. I just knew him. He wrote a book on Greek. That's it, until like the 1980s sometime, and I find out gradually more and more and more. And okay, he founds the denomination you're in, right? The OPC, Orthodox Presbyterian Church. He founds, but before that, he founds a new seminary, Westminster in Philadelphia. Can you elaborate on all those things? Because they were all crisis issues, weren't they?
Right. Well, in the fallout of the book, the major turning point, I think, in the Presbyterian controversy was 1925. There had been an affirmation of 5 necessary and essential articles of faith necessary for anyone to be ordained in the church. One of those articles was the virgin birth of Christ. And in 1923, at the Presbytery of New York, 2 ministers were ordained who would not affirm the virgin birth. They didn't deny it, but they didn't affirm it. So this created a controversy in the Presbytery that trickled up to the General Assembly, such that by 1925, the Assembly was ready to reaffirm the virgin birth, and liberals in the Presbytery of New York and the Synod of New York were ready to walk away from the church, where they were willing to separate from it over this. And the moderator at the assembly was Charles Erdman, which is one of the reasons why at the Presbycast podcast, they have the phrase, "Don't be an Erdman," who taught practical theology at Princeton Seminary. So another member of that Princeton Seminary world, which is not known to be Reformed, Orthodoxy, all that, but there were people there who were wobbly. So Erdman appoints a committee to study the sources of controversy in the church. The report that they issued in 1926 and 1927 basically blamed conservatives the way that, say, President Biden now blames America for all of our woes. So blame the conservatives, and kind of a warning that, unless you're going to bring charges against liberals, you can't really say much about it. So you got to use the process, but you can't write a book like Christianity and Liberalism, in effect. And that study commission eventually leads to, they appoint another study committee to try to understand the controversy at Princeton Seminary between Machen and Erdman and other aspects of it. That leads to a report which recommends that the seminary be reorganized such that the conservative board of directors that oversaw academic affairs at the seminary, they became a minority within a general board of trustees. And so Princeton Seminary lost the conservative control of the seminary within those different boards. And at that point, the recommendation finally went through in 1929. The reorganization also went through, and Machen and other conservatives decided to form a new seminary, Westminster Seminary, which was going to continue the Princeton tradition, as it were. I'm with you by Zoom, and I'm presently in Center City, Philadelphia. I'm only 2 or 3 blocks away from where Machen lived when he moved to Philadelphia, as well as from where the seminary was originally at 1528 Pine Street. And that didn't settle any of the controversies. I mean, there is a question whether the Presbyterian Church will allow. That becomes a particularly.
You cut out on us. It looked like you cut out on us whether the Presbytery will allow something.
Oh, sorry. Whether the Presbytery would allow Westminster Seminary students to serve in the church, to be ordained.
Okay. And
that particularly becomes a question after 1932. There's a famous report, so-called Rethinking Missions, or the Hocking Report, which is a report paid for by John Rockefeller. It's sponsored by the 7 or 8 largest Protestant denominations, and they want to study Protestant missions, foreign missions, particularly in China, but also more generally in Asia. They come back with recommendations that basically preaching the gospel, evangelism, is not what missions should be doing. Missionaries should be cooperating with other world religions and trying to elevate the conditions, economic, political, social, educational, of indigenous peoples and other societies. That's the recommendation. Machen throws a red flag, writes an overture, trying to get reforms within the Presbyterian Church. Board of Foreign Missions, that effort fails. And so in 1933, I think, he forms the Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions. That's a mouthful, the Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions. And that is what becomes the matter that brings Machen to trial. The Presbyterian Church will not allow a rival missions agency. All the Independent Board could send out was about 6 missionaries compared to thousands for the Presbyterian Church's missionary agencies. But 6 missionaries, this little group was a threat. And they bring Machen to trial for violating his ordination vows and other matters. 6 items, among them even breaking the 9th commandment in describing the church the way they did. That trial goes through 1935. He is convicted of breaking his vows. He appeals that to the General Assembly of 1936. The Assembly upholds the verdict of the Presbytery. And at that point, Machen, about 3 days after the General Assembly, and other conservatives form the Orthodox Presbyterian Church.
So this is cancel culture 1930s style?
In effect, yes. The parallels are actually quite remarkable. I mean, so whatever you want to say about progressivism or progressive liberalism, I think there's a good version of liberalism, which is the American founding and certain aspects of, Democratic Party represented this for a long time. Republicans were actually less inclined sometimes to support it, but the American institutions of government and politics are pretty liberal in the 18th century sense, but the progressive era, the New Deal era, saw wrinkles added to liberalism and progressivism that I think did make it possible to cancel people who got out of line, who didn't walk the walk.
One of the things, you don't know a lot about our mission, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. We are missionaries to cults and non-Christian religions. So I spend a lot of time at events like the Parliament of World Religions, 8,200 people from around the world, in order to be able to interact with them with the gospel. We deal with cults and that sort of thing. And as a result, we end up also dealing with a lot of churches to help them understand, here's what these groups believe. Here's how you can attempt to proclaim the gospel. But more than that, the question that keeps coming back to me is, how is it that the church keeps falling back into error? I mean, this seems like a new thing to many people, what we're seeing currently going on. And I have to point out, if you go back and read the New Testament, almost every letter was written to correct bad behavior, false doctrine, false teachers, and lay down sound doctrine. This is not new. It's a recurring theme. What we're seeing today is not new. It's a recurring theme. And Machen picked it up in the 1920s. Am I inaccurate in that at all?
No, I don't think so. I mean, one of Machen's responses to people who said to him, well, why can't you just be loving? That's what the Apostle Paul recommends in 1 Corinthians 13, the great song of love in the New Testament. And Machen, like to point out that that whole book of 1 Corinthians is filled with polemics. It's all about trying to correct error. So you can't even have 1 Corinthians 13 without polemics there. So the idea that the church should somehow return to the spirit of the New Testament, or the spirit of Christ and the apostles, is it's just very selective, obviously. And, Protestants, Reformation was a great endeavor, tried to correct lots of errors in the Western church, and the Protestant churches have struggled to maintain it. I think it's the nature of living in a fallen world, and different ways of handling the very many-sided aspects of Christian ministry. I mean, you can't. I mean, whether it's in the setting of a state church or an established church, which is what the Protestant churches were generally when the Reformation happened. You have state churches, say in Geneva, or State Church of Scotland, or the State Church in the Netherlands. You have to make some compromises sometimes with the magistrates who are paying the bills for the church. And then once you gain independent churches, voluntary churches, which come especially in the United States after the founding and the disestablishment of churches, then you still have to worry about who's going to pay for the ministry of the church, who the patrons are going to be, and whether you have to sometimes do things to keep people happy. I mean, I think we all face this even in our local congregations. There might be somebody in the church who could use some correction, but as long as it doesn't get too far out of hand, maybe you go along with it. It's just the nature of human existence, church existence.
It seems like what the liberals were able to do in the teens, 20s, and 30s, especially 20s and 30s, was to cast the narrative as unity versus orthodoxy,
Right.
And that they were what helped them to succeed was their ability to associate unity with love,
Mm-hmm.
and orthodoxy with meanness and mean-spiritedness and divisiveness. And wasn't that like already in the water, though? In a lot of people were saying things like doctrine divides, service unites. Those were like slogans that were being used. Yeah.
Well, I in my work, which is now getting older, but I seem to recall that phrase being much more common in the 1920s, in the midst of the controversy itself after 1922. I still haven't quite figured out the motivation and the thought behind that, whether it's a way of silencing the people, whether these people actually did believe that ministry divides and doctrine divides somehow. Ministry unites, and doctrine divides. I mean, I think some people did think that. I mean, I still think we have good people, even in conservative churches, who don't want to get too bogged down in doctrine and want piety, devotion, rallying around our common Lord, etc., to be the kind of the thing that brings us together. But I don't know how, if people thought they were just being manipulative, this would be a good strategy to keep some people in the dark about the situation. I mean, I think people had a variety of motives for using those phrases, which is what makes it, pretty clever.
Some may, but I would suggest that there's an idea of redefining the faith, whether it's intentional or not, I'm not sure, that niceness is the closest thing to godliness. To say someone is wrong is not nice and therefore ungodly. Now, if that's happening, then it really influences how you approach the faith and how you approach those who say, look, these things are essential. The deity of Christ is essential. The Trinity is essential. Salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone is essential. These are essential things. We can't give up on those. It doesn't mean we don't care for the poor. You can do both. But we do see this, and I found your title of your book about deconstructing sort of interesting, because that came at a time when the Brian McLaren and others were actually in the process of deconstructing the faith, under the tutelage of Father Richard Rohr, who's a panentheist, and have really reorganized the faith for many churches today as a result of it. One of the questions we have here, by the way, we're going to just detract one moment, and then we're going to have a break. And this comes from Lay Regeneras, however you say that. How much did Machen influence Francis Schaeffer? A lot, little, any at all?
I believe Schaeffer went to Westminster maybe one semester when Machen was there, and maybe not even that. I think he went after Machen died, but I'm not confident. I wish I had those dates in front of me. I don't think Machen did influence Schaeffer a lot. I do think Van Til did. Not to say that Schaeffer was inherently a disciple of Van Til. They had differences, but I think Van Til really stuck in his mind. And Schaeffer in Europe, he does become involved with Dutch Reformed thinkers like Brookmacher, for instance, the guy who was art historian, art critic. So I do think that side of Schaeffer's time at Westminster planted the seeds of the Dutch Reformed world, and made Schaeffer. I think he was a popularizer of Kuyperianism or Neo-Calvinism, depending on what you want to call it. But he left the Westminster to study at Faith Theological Seminary, which was Carl McIntyre Seminary, and McIntyre and Machen parted company in roughly 1935 or 6 when McIntyre had a coup within the independent board and took control of it, and in effect kicked Machen out just before Machen's death. So that would have been 1936. And I don't necessarily think that Schaeffer was a disciple of McIntyre either, but he did, for whatever reason, 1930s, 1940s, put his credentials, his membership in the Bible Presbyterian Church, and served there, I think, under their auspices in a way while he was a missionary in Europe. And then eventually, when that church split, and the moderates, say, in the Bible Presbyterians became
RPCES,
right. That's where Schaeffer went, but there's not a great influence there. In fact, some ways, Schaeffer made an important speech about the time 1980, maybe it's 1976 or 81. There were all sorts of efforts to try to bring the OPC into both the RPCES and the PCA. Eventually, those failed by 1986 entirely.
Yeah.
But the RPCES did join with PCA.
Yeah.
And Schaeffer made a speech at one of those assemblies, I don't remember which one, which was kind of critical of some of the reasons that led to the formation of the OPC, if I recall correctly.
Really?
Sort of. I mean, just as far as let's emphasize what are the important doctrines and not get bogged down in side issues. And there are plenty of conservatives, plenty of people in the OPC that can get, sort of doctrinally geeky at times and think that the thought of Meredith Kline or the thought of
oh man, there's a lot of fights being fought there.
Right. And those ideas, those arguments, I think are very worthwhile for sharpening minds and having greater insights into Christian theology and to biblical teaching. But if you begin to try to make those test cases for orthodoxy
they become extremely contentious. Yeah.
Right.
Speaking of test cases, some people can get testy, and this is the kind of time of the year where that can happen, especially amongst progressives. They're going to be challenged. Ron, what do you have to say?
Yeah, well, our friends at World End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time is gone, they want to remind you of something. It's coming up. After 4 semesters at your small progressive liberal arts college, you're flying home to visit your red state relatives. You remember to bring your emotional support puppies. You packed all your comfort blankets and pillows. You even remembered your adult coloring books. But it still feels like something's missing. You don't feel, I don't know, safe. What can you do? You need instant safe space. Instant safe space comes with patented anti-free speech technology. It gives you, and I'm waiting for the slide now, guaranteed protection from, and my animation's a little slow, trigger warnings, microaggressions, unwelcome ideas, cognitive dissonance. Feel protected this holiday season. Feel safe with instant safe space from World's End Theology Outlet. So, anyways, I was thinking while you guys were talking about Schaeffer and how he is so similar to Machen, especially toward the end of his life. I was at the final L'Abri conference in Knoxville in 1984, 6 weeks before he died. And I had just purchased the complete works of Francis Schaeffer. I was so proud of them, right? And then I get to the conference and I find out that there's this new book, The Great Evangelical Disaster. And I said, what? It's like, I just bought the complete works. Why couldn't he die first before I get this? Well, anyways. So now I have the Great Evangelical Disaster right next to, So they really are
complete works.
The complete works. I have a friend who was an editor at Crossway when that came out. But he was like sounding this huge alarm and toward the end of his life. And I think he was absolutely right about so much that he said. And similar to the way Machen was absolutely right about what he said. They were not necessarily on the same page. Does that sound accurate to you?
I think there are important parallels there. I guess one way I qualify that is, I was, and I say this with some affection for Schaeffer because he is the one who saved me from evangelicalism. In effect, I went to L'Abri back when I was in college, took a year off, only spent half of that, actually only 3 months at the Swiss L'Abri, and I met Schaeffer and I met his wife and had the walk with him, which everybody does who enrolls there. And he was the one who put Reformed Protestantism on my radar. And from there, I joined PCA churches initially, and went to Westminster Seminary, and then, of all things, at Harvard Divinity School, I started reading Machen and read Christianity and Liberalism for the first time. But it was a gradual transition, and even submersion into this world, and Schaeffer was largely responsible for it. But I guess the way I perceived Schaeffer at the end of his life, I thought he was turning much more political. And in fact, when I was at L'Abri in the fall of 1976, that was, I think, when he made his first appearance on the 700 Club with Pat Robertson. And that was kind of the beginning. I think he was working on the movie then with Frank Schaeffer, How Should We Then Live, which really took off and did channel a lot of people into the pro-life movement, which was very important. I mean, I don't want in any way want to detract from that, but Schaeffer was doing much more. He was worried much more about American politics, American society, and I think blowing the whistle on those developments, many of which could only be remedied in some ways, at least at a social level, by politics. Whereas Machen was very critical of the New Deal. Some of the last columns he wrote in the Presbyterian Guardian were about the dangers of increasing bloat of the federal government. So Machen had a side of him as well of that, but still I think Machen he put a lot of most of his bet in the end on the church, and didn't really think about Christians organizing politically as a solution. And I do think Schaeffer was kind of interested in the political aspects of it. I don't know. I mean, he was working with C. Everett Koop. Koop was not a politician, but he did happen to be the Surgeon General during the Reagan administration. So he had some presence in the federal government. And I do think that evangelicals in the 80s and continuing, but really began to put more energy into politics than into church life, perhaps. I wouldn't say perhaps. I think they did. And I think Schaeffer encouraged that, whether he's to blame or not exclusively. There were plenty of other people doing that as well. Chuck Colson was involved in that later, but still he was a very important voice. Others were doing that too. So that's one way I'd say there's a difference.
Yeah. At the end of How Should We Then Live, I remember Schaeffer had this kind of monologue about tyranny, how he thought we were heading toward it. Machen, I've heard you characterize him as a libertarian, or on that side of the spectrum more. If we were to plug him into one of today's categories, I don't even know exactly how I would think of Schaeffer politically, but and you're right. I mean, the impression I get is he was far more concerned about the church. I mean, he was not unconcerned about the government, the state, and encroachment. He spoke against the idea of starting a Department of Education, things like that. But what I'm thinking about now is it's like one of the things I said earlier is people read this book and it's like we're reading about today. How much overlap do you think there is? And what is the same and what is different as we read?
Well, before I answer that, I'd like to read a quote here because I think your question and my question are somewhat connected.
Oh, good.
In the Acton article, you write that simply having the truths of Scripture or being agents of God's kingdom was no basis for Christian nationalism. The spirituality of the church went hand in hand with limited government, constitutionalism, and federalism. At least it did for Machen and a strand of conservative Protestants like him. It seems like we have something kind of rising up today that is a similar idea, using the government to transform culture into a state morality that we can tip our hats to. Everyone should live according to this morality. It doesn't happen to be a Christian morality, though. Is there a similarity between what we're seeing from progressives today, Dan's Christian faith, and what he was writing about in 1923?
Okay, we try to combine the two in a way. So I guess one way of proceeding is to talk about an element of timelessness about the book, or relevance of the book. Part of that owes to Machen's talking about basic Christian doctrines. People who read the book, I think, will learn a lot of Christian theology and the categories that Reformed people, but Protestants more generally, use to think about God, human sinfulness, Christ, the church, salvation. And one of the, every time I reread the book, one of the things that really impresses me is the chapter on salvation and the importance of the death and resurrection of Christ, and Machen's defense of the vicarious atonement. It's very powerful to me, because Machen explains the enormity of sin and the only remedy for it. And, that's not a political consideration. It's not even a matter of church polity or worship. I mean, Machen does get to church government in a way in the last chapter on the church, especially ordination exams and ordination requirements with subscription. And his book ends with an appeal to can't we simply have a worship service that is free from politics, in effect? But the way that he gets there, and I think the kind of the high point of the book is that chapter on salvation and his understanding of Christ's work on the cross as an atonement for sin. And I do think that people who read that, I mean, that's just something that I think Christians need to hear all the time, be reminded of, and to hear too. There's an explanation of the supernatural character of Christianity. I mean, that's also one of the arguments he makes, is that liberalism tries to gut Christianity of all the supernatural stuff because it's the stuff that people who are scientific and educated, it doesn't make any sense to them. We know, science tells us people can't rise from the dead. Science tells us you can't have a virgin birth. But Machen says, wait a minute, without that supernatural work, without God intervening into human affairs, there's no hope of salvation. Otherwise, all you're going to do is get some kind of moral program to lift yourself up out of the mire of your sinful life, which again is why the cross becomes so prominent in Machen's understanding of salvation. So that is really important. I guess, one of the parallels with today, I mean, there are Christian nationalists obviously out there. There's the book by Stephen Wolfe on Christian nationalism. There's Doug Wilson's, I guess, recent book on Christendom. And these are efforts, I think, to try to use arguments for Christians to use government in some way to have a more Christian society. But there's not a lot about doctrine or theology in those proposals. I think the one irony is that where you do find a kind of theology is in the social justice movement, where the penalty for sin is death. If you violate the norms of progressive truths, you get canceled. There's no hope of redemption. So there is that kind of righteousness, and the gap between the sinners who violate righteousness, and Joshua Mitchell, who teaches at Georgetown University in politics, he wrote a book about this a couple of years ago. Christianity at least had a remedy for forgiveness from sin.
Right.
People today still have a very high view of righteousness and how bad sin is. Again, it's far removed from what the Bible reveals about God's holiness and human sinfulness, as well as the law of God. But there is that kind of basic architecture to our time, it seems to me. I think that Josh Mitchell is convincing about this as well, where people are kind of applying godlike standards of holiness to wayward sinners, and they don't die literally, but they do suffer.
They get canceled, and if you happen to be, let's say, like myself, a white sinner, there is zero redemption. There is only perpetual penance paid, with no hope of redemption at all.
Well, if you learn how to grovel real good,
Your original sin, my original sin as a white man, it can never really go away.
Right.
But it is remarkable. There's parallels there with the Augustinian, Pauline doctrine of original sin. But
John McWhorter has pointed this out, and he was castigated for it, that wokeness is religious. And he found all these parallels, that the penance parallel, all of them, and laid them out. And people, I've seen people who are conservative reform people diss him for it, And I think what they didn't like about him is, here's an atheist telling us, but he was accurate.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I listened to John with Glenn Lowry a lot.
Love it.
I think John can sometimes sound wooden in the way he says it, but I think the and he's not a religious guy, but I think there have been Christians who have made a similar point, and I think it's something that John would agree with, which is, I think Ross Douthat has made this point in a number of his columns, which is, without God, there's a hole in the soul, and people will try to fill it with something else. And this kind of progressive social justice movement is one way to do it. And because it is so apocalyptic, it is so cataclysmic. We are on the verge of destruction, whether it's climate or COVID or race or something, that, there is an element of, we're on the precipice all the time. Not unlike if we thought we were living before a holy God all the time. I mean, that's, why Christians don't have to perhaps worry about that as much if they're trusting in Christ. But still, that element of teetering on potential judgment every day is akin in a way to the predicament that human beings find ourselves, sinful human beings find ourselves.
Was that common, that attitude in Machen's day as well?
I don't think so, because in part the churches, I don't want to go soft on mainline Protestants, but I have been teaching some courses lately that have made me a little bit nostalgic for the influence that the mainline churches had on American society and maintaining certain moral norms out there, and having the churches being vehicles for those moral norms, and worship services that go with it, and affirming the Nicene Creed or whatever they do with that. So there's a Trinitarian element. Again, people may not believe it, but at least some of the progressivism and social justice that was part of the mainline churches also came with this other package of the stuff of Christian worship, Christian theology.
It was Ozzy
and we just lost that. I'm sorry.
It was kind of liberal. It was the church for the Ozzy and Harriet generation, the Leave It to Beaver, the public morality,
right?
Moral lessons,
right? And those churches have just lost so many members and so much influence. And I do think evangelicals responded to that, and they tried to fill the void, because I do think Protestantism was a big part of American history, American society, American culture. And so to secularize very quickly, and Schaeffer was also very much responding to this as well, to secularize very quickly could have really hurt the country, which it did. So evangelicals and Roman Catholics, evangelicals and Catholics together, for instance, were trying to keep a Christian presence in public life. And it happened at a very bad time in effect, because progressivism had really escaped a Christian outlook, and it had become much more secular. So these Christians are trying to maintain the old norms of American society at a time when, don't you know what you're doing? That stuff is passé. It's gone. Plus it was oppressive. It was racist. It was misogynist. It was however you want to put it. So we're at we're actually almost 40 years from that, when Schaeffer was writing The Great Evangelical Disaster and the like. And, so the people who are arguing for Christian nationalism, or the Roman Catholics who call themselves integralists, they're also responding to a similar problem in American society: how to put the genie back in the bottle, or how to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. What other cliche can I use there? But it's very difficult. And if the mainline churches had not capitulated so thoroughly, maybe we'd be in a better situation.
Well, now we see at least elements of the evangelical church also capitulating,
right?
Which is a problem.
It's alarming, really. Yeah,
it is very alarming. You don't follow kind of the Russell Moore idea of the faith, then you are a severe radical dominion theology sort of. I'm not any of that. But because I disagree with that, I would be classified as, on both sides of the spectrum, as someone to be canceled.
Some of these people are like moving targets, it seems. Like
Yeah.
Russell Moore, David French. It's like which way are they going to move next week? But
Right.
so far it's been to the New York Times mostly. So,
which is why the attack Hamas on Israel of October 7th was pretty intriguing to me, because I haven't seen French's writing about that, but Russell Moore and other writers at Christianity Today, for instance, really came out strong behind Israel.
Yeah.
And they weren't taking their cues from the Ivy League universities at that point, which is, I think, a lot of what they had done. So on this particular matter, now I think maybe they're trying to back off some and trying to show a little bit more sympathy for Palestinians and the difficulties of the situation, which are many. I'm not denying that, but it was initially that they weren't calculating, it seemed to me, in their response to that attack. They were right on board with Israel.
But when your essential methodology is to always side with the lowest victim group, the one that's got the foot on the neck, so to speak, which now we know maybe wasn't a foot on a neck. But when we have to pick the worst off victim group, and then you're faced with two choices that are in competition with each other, which one is more of a victim? The methodology is the problem.
Right. Right.
That's the problem.
Right. And even behind that, I think the problem too, and this is what evangelical success, such as it was, however successful they were politically. I mean, I do think there was a measure of success by the time of the second Bush George W.'s presidency. I mean, I think at that point there were a number of professionally trained evangelicals that could staff positions in the government. But there was also, going with that, the whole range of evangelical scholarship that had gone on from the 1980s down to 2010 or so. So there was a measure of success that evangelicals seemed to enjoy. And then after Trump, et cetera, how do we maintain our position? How do we maintain our positions of influence if our movement is going to be associated with this guy who the rest of the influential world hates? And that was another really important turning point. So they wanted to maintain some of the influence that they had achieved. And I think that's one of the ways I try to, anyway, explain people like Russell Moore and David French.
Yeah. Well, here we are, 2020.
Well, here we are. And we haven't solved the whole crisis of the entire planet yet.
That's what progressivism is for. That's what progressivism is for, solving the crisis of whatever crisis du jour.
Well, my pastor and I talk about this kind of stuff from time to time, because although he like me, he's concerned about the political scene, it doesn't take the priority in our brains as to what we're doing. And kind of our take on it is this: our job biblically is not to transform culture. We just don't find that in Scripture. I don't find that anywhere in Scripture. What I find is that individuals are transformed spiritually, and when enough of them transform, culture begins to follow behind.
Yeah. I have one thought.
Our task as believers, claiming the gospel and growing believers.
You're preaching to the choir here, Don, because I think both Dr. Hart and I affirm what's called the spirituality of the church, which got me in a little trouble when I started talking about that last week with somebody. Westminster Confession, chapter 31, paragraph 4. But I have just one thought. I don't want to start. I can't start any new conversation, but it seems to me that the liberalism of Machen's day became a victim of the ideology of the 60s.
Yeah.
And what we're looking at now, it's like the liberalism or the progressivism of our day is going to become the victim of something.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
Maybe it is the October 7th massacre. Maybe maybe that's what's going to that's going to start something that will eventually bury. Not that another progressive ideology isn't going to come along, or progressive movement to infiltrate the church and do all kinds of damage to culture. But I'm just saying this looks like a turning point moment, October 7th, to me. I don't know why, it just does. So,
No, I think it has the real potential to be that.
yeah. So.
Well, Dr. Hart, we really appreciate you having.
Oh yes, it's an honor and a blessing.
Well,
thank you.
And we may in the future see if you would join us again. Now that you've met with us and see what our stick kind of is, you can decide.
If we haven't scared you off, we'll try harder. So.
Well, yeah, I'm glad I could finally make it. We tried several times and teaching schedule would not allow it, but no, I'm glad to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, should I try to really scare him off now with our end credits? Okay, let's give to whom credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D. Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polly Gummas. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys. Oh, dehumanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Joe Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is wiretapping, and original idea sourcing comes from Drew Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never.
Don't forget to remind me to change the copyright date pretty soon, Don, okay?
That'll be like after next week. So.
Yeah, I know. Thank you again, Dr. Hart.
Thank you again.
AKA